So we are going back now, mid-17th century, 1600s. King Charles I was perhaps the monarch, I think, that opened the trade between Britain and Africa. That was originally gold, minerals, etc., that opened that trade up to human trafficking, to the enslavement, to the movement of enslaved Africans. King Charles II, who followed him, actually was responsible, along with his then cousin, who later became James I, totally responsible for and ownership of the Royal African Company that moved more Africans off of the continent into the Americas than any other company in history. So what we're talking about here is the involvement of British monarchy in the ownership and the operation of the transatlantic, I prefer to call it, of the European slave trade, the movement of Africans here into the Caribbean. And so we now see this movement, and even before Charles I, we can be addressing Elizabeth I, and we see this recurrence, of course, in the names that we're talking about. And so we now supposedly should be mourning the death of Elizabeth II, and welcoming a Charles III. But we know them. We know these Charleses, and we know these Elizabeths. So there's virtually no mourning for me at this moment.
I'd also like to bring in Mutaba.
Of people claim that Queen Elizabeth was not responsible for what her ancestors did. She herself said that slavery was legal at the time, so she don't really recognize what we in the Caribbean is talking about. Now, we have to realize in 1952, that was when she ascended the throne of England. And if you check the history between 1952 and now, you will see that even though slavery was abolished, but they, what we call it, redefined slavery and call it colonialism. And colonialism in this part of the world was represented by the throne of England. So we're not really talking now about an individual person. We're talking about a corporation, an institution, which is called the Monarchy of England, that has totally devastated a lot of the progress we could have made if it wasn't for this what we call colonialism interpreted to us as slavery still. Now, we have to remember, in her time, there was the Mama uprising, which is a very interesting case because she was actually named Queen of England when she was in Kenya. And the cruel and wicked things that the British Army did to the African people there cannot be seen as just, okay, that is just something. And she had never granted any sympathy or say anything that would say, well, you know, she have a kind of art to what was taking place. We look in South Africa during the apartheid system. The British is part of that wicked apartheid regime that devastated and killed thousands of Africans who was fighting for right to be a person in South Africa. And it was recently, even during the time of Mandela and Winnie Mandela, that we was told that they were still on the list of terrorist groups. And even though England and this queen was ruling at that time, there was no effort to find out what is it they can do to alleviate the problems that confront African people in this part of the world. Now we come to the Caribbean in this time. The Caribbean has been devastated. We know in history, one of the richest plantation owners, cane owners, was a man by the name of William Beckford. William Beckford got his riches and became one of the richest men in England in that time. And up to this day, when we recognize how much people died because of the institutionalized slavery that they call colonialism, up to this day, the movement of our people, especially in Jamaica now, where our constitution was given to us by England through the hands of the so-called Bustamante and Norman Manley, who was recognized during that time in 1962 when Jamaica was supposed to be getting independent. They went to England and they got a constitution that is now part and parcel of what Jamaicans are supposed to live by. And when we look at that constitution, it does not include ownership of land in Jamaica by the people. If you go into the courts of Jamaica, it says the Crown versus Tom Shook, or the Crown versus John Tom. That is what we have to face right now. Now, when you recognize that Jamaica is supposed to be an independent country, most Jamaicans say Jamaica not independent. That even though people say it's like it's not rich, it's not really governing the country, but the head of state is the Governor General representing the Queen of England in an independent country. How the hell that is possible? That you have an independent country that is the first lady is the Governor General's wife, not the Prime Minister's wife. And they set and designed the Constitution that way. And these so-called, we call them bossy slaves, jacket and tie slaves, that they continue to uphold and maintain that regime that has committed so much atrocities and crimes in this century, in this time. They have been committing it and still committing it. And we don't see why we should now sit down and say 12 day mourning. That to show how backward and how what we call the Stockholm Syndrome has grabbed our leaders in the Caribbean. That here's a family that represent criminal activities for your ancestors. And now you start to love them. How is that possible? How is that possible that we who know the history is keep repeating the history? We know what is taking place in this democratic, so-called democratic country that is still honoring the most gruesome and cruel monarchy that ever exists. And we know of it. How can we now sit and say, we're going to have 12 days of mourning? 12 days of mourning for what? What we're mourning that for? Why we're not mourning for the thousands and millions of people that died across the Atlantic Ocean? We're not mourning for all the warriors of our time. There's no day for Taki, there's no day for Nani. All of these people who died because they stand up and struggle to get out of the claws of British colonialism. We now sit and say, we must mourn. I am not one of them who's mourning, and I can talk for a lot of Rastafari brethren in Africa, because we came to Jamaica not by free will, but by force. Nobody asked to come to the Caribbean. None of these Africans, at least my ancestors, never asked to come here. So the Rastafari community is crying out, saying, reparation, repatriation, meaning that those who desire us of going back to Africa must be able to do this without the argument about Commonwealth of Nations. And that is really an hindrance. There's no moving away from the Queen and the monarchy if the countries that claim getting rid of the monarchy is one. But if you still in the Commonwealth of Nations, that still bind you and grip you to the same colonial system that you are trying to break free from. There's no getting rid of the Queen or getting rid of the King, and you're still into the Commonwealth. We as Jamaicans, there's a lot of grandfathers and who's living today who fought in the Royal Air Force during the World War II and who went to England to help build up England. And what we hear now, first of all, Jamaicans have to have a visa to go to the so-called motherland. Jamaicans is not allowed to stay there at a certain length of time. And now we have the Windrush people who just recently, we see that they're trying to send back people who was in England for 60 years and have children at them house and everything. They're sending them back to Jamaica. That is one of the most racist things that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Where you go to build a country. Yes.
Mutawaruka, I'd like to bring in...
Well, it would have been our second letter addressed to British monarchs. Earlier, I think maybe about a year or two before, Prince Harry was here. And certainly this year or last year, I mean, I'm getting lost within this COVID mess. The other brother was also here, who is now, I guess, destined to be the next King of England. And our letter simply said to them that we were very tired and rather insulted by their approach of telling us things that we already knew. That we knew that slavery was horrible. They didn't have to tell us that. That we knew that genocide was committed. They didn't have to tell us that. And our letter simply said to them, well, please, do not come here and insult us further by saying things that the Tony Blairs have already said, that your Minister of Foreign Affairs had come and addressed the Parliament in Jamaica and looked at us as Caribbean people, as descendants of enslaved people, to tell us that we should forget it and just move on. That just let's forget this, move on. And that is essentially what we said in our letter. Now, in response to your the other part of your question of what does reparations look like for us? What does this moment mean to us in the reparations struggle? I think certainly that we're asking Britain to reassess its role in the intentional on the development of Africa and this Caribbean. Asking Britain to reassess its role in the genocide, in the plunder, in the violence that it exerted on African people on the continent and here in the Caribbean. And that in reassessing this role, that it must understand clearly that the morality of the situation, the ethics of the situation calls for repair. And in that repair, we essentially are talking reparations, that you have committed crimes against humanity, and that there is a moral and an ethical demand that you acknowledge these crimes and you do your best in the best way you can to make whole the holes that you have really left in the history and in the lives of African people. I'm a member of the Caricom Reparations Commission as chairperson of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Commission, and that commission has issued a 10-point plan that defines for the international community, defines for us here in the Caribbean, how we see reparations. The plan that we have issued is a development plan. It's in contrast, let's say, to the legacy reparation plans that are being developed elsewhere in the diaspora, where individuals are identified as the recipient of reparations. The Caricom Reparations Plan talks of development. In the first instance, it identifies those areas in our development across this region where the hurt of enslavement and genocide continues to exist and continues to impact on the lives of Caribbean people today. And we are saying that in that development plan that we are inviting inviting, is the word that I think we have to use at this point in time, Europe to sit at the table with us and to discuss this development plan, addressing areas in education, in health care. And as Mutabarak has just said, we include in that this whole question of repatriation of those persons who want to go back to the continent. We're talking
we have 15 seconds.
Yeah, we're talking psychological. We're talking debt. We're talking debt relief. A number of issues within that 10-point plan.